In recent decades, public trust in politics and politicians has been on the decline. Waning faith in the political status quo gave rise to populist sentiment among citizens and helped mobilise populist leaders on both the right and left.
She will keep our rigged system in place. I alone can fix it.
This trend culminated in the populist wave that has seen anti-establishment figures win elections across the world. And then, in March 2020, the pandemic struck. Faced with an existential threat, citizens found themselves dependent on government to keep us safe and provide unprecedented economic support. Experts, not least of all doctors and scientists, were suddenly thrust into the spotlight and given authority to make decisions affecting the lives of millions across the world. As the dust settles on the global coronavirus pandemic, how has it changed our relationship to politics and public authority? To begin to answer this question, the University of Cambridge, in collaboration with YouGov and the Human Surveys Project, has collected data from hundreds of thousands of individuals surveyed during the 2021 pandemic.
The object of this report was to provide the first comprehensive look at how the pandemic has changed citizen beliefs and attitudes to democracy across the world.
We were primarily interested in three of the indicators in the Human Surveys Project: satisfaction with democracy, support for democracy, and trust in government.
We have worked primarily with data from the YouGov Globalism survey, which was collected in the past 2 years through the pandemic, which covers 81,000 respondents in 27 countries.
The data found that support for populism has collapsed during the pandemic.
Populism is in decline across the board. Populist leaders see decreasing approval ratings. Electoral support for populist parties is in decline. And maybe most importantly, we see that public approval with populist ideas has fallen dramatically.
While populists were gaining momentum before the pandemic hasn't been good for them. Populist leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu or Donald Trump have been removed from office, and others like Jair Bolsonaro will face a difficult re-election in the months to come.
The overarching trend was that electoral support for populist parties had significantly decreased since the outset of the pandemic. That outcome is striking not only because the downward trend is evident in most countries, but because before the pandemic, the trend of vote intention for populist parties was positive.
On average, we find that populist leaders have seen 10 percentage point decline in their approval ratings from the second quarter of 2020 to the last quarter of this year.
We also observe a decline in populist attitudes, particularly in areas and groups of citizens that typically hold more populist views. We find a strong decline in populist attitudes in both poorer, left-behind regions and among less educated individuals.
It is among the oldest age group, those 55 years and older, that we can see the greatest decline in agreement with populism.
A couple of factors stood out as primary causes for why the pandemic has blunted the populist wave.
The first is the simple fact that populist leaders mishandled the pandemic. While one or two populist leaders like Narendra Modi in India did respond proactively to the threat presented by COVID-19, by and large populist leaders engaged in denialism, obfuscation, and ultimately did too little, too late.
Another aspect we looked at in this report was how the pandemic affected polarization. Particularly, we looked at affective polarization, which describes the extent of animosity between supporters of different political parties. Previous research decades before the pandemic, affective polarization seems to be steadily increased in many countries. Our data indicates, however, that the pandemic might actually have reversed the trend. Affective polarization has decreased in most countries from the last pre-pandemic observation. We see a particularly strong increase in Western Europe, in countries such as Germany, Sweden or France, where this proportion of highly polarized individuals shrunk by 15 to 20%. The likely explanation seems to be that a common threat, such as the pandemic, brings people together. There simply seems to be less people which are highly polarized and susceptible to this populist discourse.
Some have talked about division, but that's not what I see. That's not what I've seen these past weeks across the country. I see Canadians standing together.
One of the big contributors to the populist wave has been the growth of regional inequality. And one of the really fascinating things that we've seen during the pandemic is that those differences have actually come down. So the places that were hit hardest economically by COVID-19 were the big global cosmopolitan hubs like London and New York or the San Francisco Bay Area. Whereas on the other hand, those regions which have been left behind economically have actually seen a lot of people moving to those regions, have seen businesses moving to those regions, have seen an increase in domestic tourism, and have actually done much better. In many ways, the pandemic has seen a complete reversal in some of the key trends in place over the last decade, if not the last generation. Trust in politicians and in politics had been declining, anti-establishment politicians, populists, were on the rise, faith in experts had been in decline. Then the pandemic happened, and we've really swung completely around from a populist wave to a technocratic revival.
Although the decline in populism may initially appear a win for liberal democracy, the data also revealed an erosion of democratic values and decreased support for basic civil liberties.
The pandemic has been a legitimacy test for democracies around the world.
There is the question of the ability of democracies to handle crises like the one we're living right now. China succeeded in getting its outbreak under control through the imposition of draconian restrictions that could hardly be implemented in Western liberal democracies, which had a much more difficult time reacting and preventing full-scale epidemics.
There is this long-standing idea in political science that when people feel existentially threatened, they are more likely to endorse illiberal attitudes. For example, to emphasize in-group attachment or to seek the protection of authority. And one of the things we have seen during the pandemic is that the proportion of survey respondents in Western Europe and the United States who say that they would be in favor of having a strong leader has gone up from about a quarter to more than a third of all respondents. But there, I think, is also the real paradox. The pandemic has made people more existentially threatened and in search of protection from authority, but it's the authority of scientists and of civil servants and of experts, and not the easy answers or promises that are on offer from populist politicians.
Overall, these findings are reassuring for the future of Western democracy. Across the world, the populist wave appears to be passing.